Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Foundations Live. I'm Paul from Foundations, and it's Tuesday afternoon. It's good to see you all. So as we go through the afternoon, please do feel free to put any comments or questions in the chat as we go, as usual. But if you haven't been with us before, let me do a quick round of introductions on the right bits and pieces to show you. There we go. So we're the national body for home improvement agencies and the Disabled Facilities Grant. And we're funded by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, which means that we're available to provide most of the support that we do free of charge for local authorities and home improvement agencies. If you're looking for closed captions this afternoon, they're currently available on Facebook and YouTube. For some reason, LinkedIn doesn't seem to be working this afternoon, but I'll work on that in a little bit and hopefully get it back online. So today we're doing a recap of the topics that we covered at the recent round of DFG Champions Roadshows, which was based very much on dealing with demand across your system for DFGs. So in a few moments, I will introduce Rachel Russell, who will talk about prioritisation during the assessment process. Then I'll do a section on prioritising DFG applications and how you look after that part of the process, and also do a recap on how you might want to use your discretion a little bit differently if you've got high demand as opposed to maybe in the past where you were maybe struggling to spend all your budget. So that's what we've got planned for this afternoon. Just a couple of notes before we start. First one is a couple of weeks ago we did a special webinar, Foundations Live, on the Delta return, which is the annual data return to central government about DFGs. The closing date for that is on the 13th of June, so that's next week. If you're responsible for it, or if you know who's responsible for it in your local authority, if you've got any problems with it whatsoever, then please do get in contact with us at Foundations. On the back of the webinar that we did couple of weeks ago, we've now put together quite a lot of resources and guidance on how to complete your Delta return, and that's available on our website. So yeah, if you need any help or assistance, there's quite detailed guidance on each of the questions on the website now, or if not, email us at deltareturns@foundations.uk.com and we'll try and help you out. And as I said, the closing date is the 13th of June, so that's getting quite close now. The other thing to let you aware of, it's June now, so this month, as usual, nominations will open for the National Healthy Housing Awards, which will be held again in Manchester and in December. So we have the usual array of categories from Home Improvement Agency of the Year, DFG Service of the Year, through to OT of the Year, Caseworker of the Year, Technical Officer of the Year. Launching that very shortly. You can already find the details on the website. And one of the things that we've done this year to hopefully make it easier to enter, on the web page, there's an AI agent that you can use to help you craft your nomination, your entry. So it doesn't write it for you. It doesn't make up a winning entry, but it does help you to craft what you've got into a compelling narrative. If you've got too many words, it helps you to cut it down a little bit, or it'll give you advice on what's missing in terms of making each answer really stand out to the judges. So we try to make it as easy and straightforward for you to enter this year. Full details will be coming a little bit later this month, but if you want to preview, all those details are now on the website. Right, so back to today's show, and I'm going to introduce Rachel.
Foundations Live.
There we go, all seamless. I know, I remember doing stuff. So I'll hand over to you then, Rachel, to take us through the assessment process.
Yeah, Lovely. Right, hopefully you can see my presentation. Yeah, so as part of the Roadshow, or the Spring Roadshow, I was tasked to look at prioritising assessments. So what I'll be covering is basically the slide deck that I used during the presentation. The reason that we did this particular section is it was about trying to explore how we prioritise well so that we maximise the health and social care benefits of adaptations. Now, when we started planning the Spring Roadshow, which we usually do about October, November time, there wasn't a great deal that was happening. And then all of a sudden, around the time of the budget and then some extra news that we all got in January, things really changed in terms of actually, do we need to think how we prioritise? So the things that happened were, in the budget, we got an extra £86 million for financial year 24-25, and then we got some additional 25-26, and then we got some additional money from the department for the previous financial year. And the clear message that we were getting from government was there's this extra money, but what we want to see is more adaptations being done, because I think what's really positive about the government's approach is that real drive for prevention and moving from that sickness to prevention model, which I'll talk about shortly. So that got me thinking, right, this isn't just going to be a presentation just going through, how you prioritise it. It was an opportunity to really rethink about, if we're going to move from that sickness to prevention model, do we need to think about how we prioritise? What's really cool, clear for the government, so those of you that get involved in writing or being involved in developing your Better Care Fund plans, is that this year what you were asked to do was really demonstrate how adaptations, the use of the DFG, supports that sickness to prevention. So how we can use adaptations to keep people at home, etc., support hospital discharge, avoid people going into long-term care. So as I say, what I did with the presentation was, it was an opportunity to reflect on how we currently prioritise and to think whether there was a different way of doing this. And this was a photograph taken, was it Westmoreland, Paul? I think it was, up in Cumbria, where Wes Streeting went to visit the HIA up there and visited this couple who just had a DFG. So once again, it's really good to see, the Minister of Health and Social Care kind of showing a real interest in DFG. So what do I mean about moving towards a more proactive prevention? So I think at the moment, the way that we prioritise is that we do lots of preventative work, particularly around the DFG, but it tends to be reactive prevention. So we're usually providing a DFG after an adverse event has happened. So somebody's been admitted into hospital, so we need that really quick DFG adaptations to get somebody out of hospital. Or it might be responding to a crisis at home where there is an imminent risk of somebody going into hospital or long-term residential care. So let's get the DFG to see if we can use adaptations to prevent that from happening. Obviously, lots of DFGs are recommended after somebody's had a fall. So that's what I mean about reactive prevention. So lots of really good work that you're already doing, but we're tending to use the DFG after the fact. It's not that proactive bit where we're, moving to that really preventative model. So when I talk about proactive prevention over the next few slides, what I'm talking about is actually using adaptations earlier, before things happen. So where we've got people with progressive conditions and they're on that early pathway in terms of their condition progress is actually using adaptations earlier on. So get them in early so that we don't have to go back in and do adaptations. Where we know that we've got people perhaps with frailty and they're perhaps on a certain pathway, and actually if we did some adaptations, that actually could prevent further decline or anticipate some functional decline, so that we can have the right environment for that person. So as their needs change, their environment actually supports them, and supporting that long-term independence. What's really interesting, that NICE have just updated their NICE guidance on falls, and one of the things that they've recommended is avoiding using predictive tools for falls. And actually what we need to do is just get the adaptations in. So again, rather than waiting for people to fall, actually kind of think about using adaptations in a more preventative way, where we know that people are possibly going to fall in the future. So that's what I mean about proactive prevention. And the reason I want to think in this way is, if we're going to move from that sickness to prevention, we're already, in terms of social care, we're already doing some fantastic stuff using the DFG that prevents issues happening after a fall or further falls, and reducing care needs. So often, when people have become disabled, we're using DFG to reduce care packages and those kind of things. So DFG is brilliant for social care because it's an asset that we can use to support people's health and well-being. So currently, when we look at assessment prioritization tools, then that's what we tend to do, is we tend to prioritize around that reactive prevention that prevents and reduces. But if we want to move towards real prevention and that proactive, I think it's also about actually needing not only to think about how we prioritise, but also the model in which we deliver adaptation services. Again, we've got some really good practice around the country, around some of those very comprehensive home improvement agencies, or what you might call a Good Homes Hub. But to support those models, actually, we need to think how we do prioritise, because our current way that we prioritise isn't quite fit for purpose, which I'll show you in a minute. The reason it's really hard, I think, or some of the challenges of moving to a more proactive way of prioritising and trying to achieve that real proactive prevention, is some of the challenges that we've got. Currently, the way that we prioritise adaptations, often we end up prioritising twice. And I've got a lovely slide to show you shortly, but often we prioritise people coming into social care. If we identify that they need a DFG, often they then go down to the adaptations team, and often they can be prioritised a second time, which can mean that people end up waiting twice significant periods of time. What we know is there is a growing demand for DFG. We're getting more complex cases, which often means that those people where perhaps we would like to do things more proactively, it feels at times that we're firefighting because we've always got those reactive cases that we're needing to come in and manage. Obviously, we know the impact of extended wait times. We've now got the research from Philip Whitehead in the Bath Out 2 project, which I'll mention again shortly. We've also got no kind of national standard way that we approach prioritisation as well. We all do things quite differently, and I think that can be challenging as well in terms of prioritising. CQC now has a focus on wait lists. Obviously, social care colleagues many of you will have gone through that CQC process, but CQC is also interested in those services that support social care around Part 1 of the Care Act, which is the Prevent, Reduce, Delay. So lots of you involved in Home Improvement Agency, adaptation services, you are supporting social care around that part of the Care Act. So CQC is interested in the work that you do and how you support people to wait well. And I'm sure Paul will pick this up later on in the webinar when he covers the bits that he did at the Roadshow. And again, it's about, I think, we do want to do things differently, but how do you balance that risk versus being proactive, and how do you balance that? So hopefully some of the ideas that we'll cover today will get you to think differently how we might be able to kind of balance that urgency, that risk, alongside being more proactive in the way that we prioritise. So I just want you to think, and at the Roadshow, we got people to think about, if you think about how you currently prioritise, be that in social care, people coming in for that initial assessment of need, but then also those individuals that are being prioritised for the application to be picked up, is actually, when you think about how you currently prioritise, actually, do you tend to prioritise in a more reactive than proactive way? And I suspect that you probably currently prioritise in a more reactive way. So the issue with prioritising in that reactive way is this is the typical kind of cycle. So we have somebody that contacts, usually social care. I appreciate there's lots of variation in terms of how services are delivered. So I appreciate this might not be typical for your local authority, but it generally is kind of that circle that we see. Somebody contacts social care. Those individuals that are lower risk then tend to be put on the wait list, while those individuals that are seen as needing that assessment due to urgency, they get that timely assessment from social care colleagues, and that's where a DFG might be identified as the right type of solution, and that then goes to the adaptation service, the home improvement agency, to then manage that case. So those people with high who are seen as high risk, that reactive way, they get that timely assessment. But those people who are at lower risk, who we call Mrs. Russell at Little Mrs. Russell at Foundations, me in 30 years' time, I'm the one that goes on the waiting list because my needs, I can probably wait a little while for an assessment, and so I go on the waiting list. What we know from Bath Out 2, and again, we've covered this in a webinar a few months ago where Philip Whitehead came and gave the findings from the study. What we know is that when Mrs. Russell waits, she is more likely to need to access more NHS health social care resources, and then when Mrs. Russell does get a DFG in her adaptations, those adaptations are less effective as well. And as she's waiting, as Bath Out 2 has demonstrated, people's needs continue to develop. And often this is when something happens, either there is some type of adverse event, so somebody ends up in hospital, they have a fall, they get referred through to social care, and then they become that higher risk individual that then gets an assessment, or they then get picked up by they get picked up, they have their assessment, and then it goes down to the adaptations team. And the drawback there is often when the assessment is done for the adaptation, if there is a wait at the HIA or the adaptations team, often that person can then end up waiting. So the drawback with this kind of traditional model of prioritising is that there are potentially two waits for assessment, the wait for the assessment of need, and then that assessment to start the application process. So if we think differently and we prioritise differently, so we've got people coming in the front door, but those individuals that are lower risk, is there an opportunity to prioritise them differently and think about, those of you that deliver that really comprehensive HIA service, where you've got that interdisciplinary team, where you've got housing advice, you've got equipment, access to equipment, assistive technology, and using the DFG in a more proactive way, so that those individuals who don't perhaps need that more specialist social care input, actually, if you've got the right resources at the HIA, the HIA is invested in to provide those that comprehensive service for those people at that low risk, so that we can use the DFG in a more proactive way. We still deal with those that need that social care expertise in that timely way, but it's just meaning that those with lower risk, where perhaps could be dealt with by that comprehensive HIA, could be dealt with by that team. And the benefit there is you've still got the same number of people coming through the system, but potentially they're only waiting once for that initial assessment of need. When it's done, then the DFG continues to be processed rather than that stop-start that we currently get. Just in terms of, we've already got some really useful tools in terms of, obviously we're talking about prioritising, which is about how quick somebody gets the assessment. But in terms of looking at that different way of doing things, then we've obviously got the Foundation's triage tool that helps identify whether it is a simple case that can be managed through that trusted assessor approach. And we've got a really good guide on implementing trusted assessor programme, as well as other tools around determining necessary and appropriate. We've also got, and we're currently doing some further work on the Adapt My Home, but we've obviously got that as a tool as well at Foundations for those individuals that want to do that self-assessment. So just want to talk about just some ideas then about actually, well, how do we do that reactive and or more proactive prioritisation? This is the reactive way of how the majority of ways I would imagine that you are currently prioritising either your assessments or those that are going on your waiting list for the application to be picked up. So it tends to be time-based response, and it tends to be based on kind of some kind of RAG rating around risk of adverse events. So that tends to be hospital admission, significant carer breakdown, safeguarding, end-of-life care needs, and hospital discharge. So I suspect those are the ways that people tend to prioritise at the moment. If we were to look at a more balanced approach, I guess, where you're taking into account both, we need to respond to those people that have got, where we need to react very quickly to prevent something happening. But if we also want to include a more proactive way to get a better balance, this was some ideas that I put forward at the Roadshow. So what you've got in the first two columns are very much how you're currently probably prioritising. But then in the second two columns are some of those elements that help us think about, actually, if we did some adaptations here, prioritise these people, actually, could we get some even better outcomes as well? So covers things like, you know, are they having, you know, are they living alone without support? Are we picking up that there might be some issues around social isolation? Has there, you know, have they got some changes in ability to communicate need? So I have a fantastic OT apprentice, Hilary, that is on placement with me. I've got two fantastic apprentices on placement with me at the moment. But Hilary is working on this as we speak, and she's spoken to, done some interviews. We had a poll on the Foundation's Facebook to get some ideas about how you're currently prioritising. So she's carrying on this bit of work, and hopefully at the end of that we'll have a tool to be able to get some feedback on what people think to it and how useful it will be. So this is just gives you an idea about what we mean about proactive prevention, and just kind of things that you kind of think about that was on the previous slide. So early signs of care strain. Have we got evidence of recent near misses? Are there changes in confidence levels? Any recent life changes that might indicate that actually if we got the adaptations in quicker, we could make them those individuals much more resilient, which is what, as I say, I've tried to pick up on that slide, trying to get the balance there. Just in terms of what we've learned, because there are some areas that are doing this already really well in terms of trying to take a much more proactive approach. And when I did a bit of reflection around what is it about those services, those teams that enable them to be more proactive and shifting towards that more preventative model that we talk about, I think what I notice, what I reflect on is often what they don't talk about OT waiting lists or social care waiting lists. I think what they talk about is we've got individuals that need a quick pathway to the right solution. So actually, given what kind of solutions that they need, given the issues that they're having, actually, how do we ensure that we create the right pathways? So rather than thinking in services, they're thinking in that system-led way, which I appreciate is that kind of higher level strategic system thinking. I think it's about recognising that I think sometimes there is some anxiety with social care about our duties, for people to have Care Act assessments, but recognising the difference, those services that recognise the difference between somebody who needs that more comprehensive Care Act assessment and that somebody that is requesting support through preventative services. And often that is those services that have those really effective front door conversation. Again, those services and systems that really understand that there isn't just one Care Act assessment, that is about taking a proportionate response, listening to the voice of the person themselves, recognising that our housing colleagues, our HIA colleagues have a whole range of skills that help understand how to prevent, reduce, delay health and social care needs. And actually, sometimes they're the more appropriate person to have that continued conversation about what is the best way to prevent, reduce, delay needs through the range of housing solutions that a HIA can deliver. So I think those areas that have recognised that and work in that joined up way. Again, those areas that have, those HIAs that have got the expertise of OTs within that team, again, that is where you tend to find this more proactive way of working. Again, what's really important there is that OTs can, obviously being the only OT that works at foundations, you can soon feel not isolated, but where you want to have that contact with other OTs. So I think those areas that have recognised that need to keep OTs connected, where perhaps they are the only OT in the team, but certainly where you've got that OT integrated within the HIA, you definitely see that move towards that more preventative approach. Again, those areas that have really invested in their trusted assessor model. So it's not just about getting everybody on their training, that it is about thinking about the governance, working with social care colleagues. So those areas that really get trusted assessor, understand that it's not just about investing in training, that it's about setting up the right governance, the right pathways. Again, those are those areas that have been more successful in implementing those trusted assessor models. And I think, again, those systems that really value HIA and housing contribution to your area's Better Care Fund plans, I think those areas that value the HIA recognise that a HIA isn't there just to deliver DFG, that there are a range of skilled practitioners within a HIA that can look beyond DFG, can really work with people to provide preventative services. Again, those areas that work in that way, again, tend to be much more effective in providing preventative models supported by a much more proactive way of prioritising. And again, just linked to that, those HIAs, adaptation services that really fit that kind of good homes hub. So as you're aware, the Centre for Aging Better has done a piece of work around really effective home improvement agencies, good home hubs. And again, where you have those comprehensive services, they tend to be much more effective and confident at delivering those more proactive adaptations. So I think that's it from me, Paul. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Rach. So in terms of, we had a few local authorities and people presenting as well,
Yeah.
didn't we, part of this section. Were there any that particularly stood out to you as doing this particularly well?
Devon really stood out for me. So Devon is a 2-tier authority, and what they've done there is really looked at how the districts work with the county. They've really thought about the pathways. They've really challenged their own thinking about, does everything need to be an OT? So Devon really stood out, and that collaborative working that they've got across county and districts. We had a really good presentation, not quite linked to DFG, but we had a really fantastic presentation by Rachel Wooden on one of the London days when we were down in London, Rachel is an occupational therapist, and with her colleague, Jaquel Runnels, has done some fantastic work that is helping to protect the DFG. So actually, if we build the right buildings, if we work with planning, if we really integrate housing into health and social care, and how housing can support, how that can protect the DFG. So that was one that really stood out. You're testing my memory now, Paul. So I'm just trying to think.
And Rachel Wooden's going to be in Birmingham, isn't she, on the at the summit?
Yeah. There was also Steph from Darlington, who is a very knowledgeable principal OT, who's just moved to Darlington. And again, they've really done some interesting work on their prioritisation tool, trying to get a more balanced approach to the way that they prioritise. So she's done some kind of work on their prioritisation tool.
Yeah, if anybody's interested in any of those, all the slides are on the website in the library section. I had a question from Karen around the research and evidence on trusted assessor models.
Yeah. Oh. I don't know whether I'll have to go away and see if there will. I am sure there is some evidence out there. I think what you can certainly link to is when people get quicker access to the DFG. So where we're not over reliant on. So thinking about the RCOT adaptations without delay. So where we're looking at OT assistants or trusted assessors, what Philip's work demonstrates is that the quicker people get access to those adaptations, the better the outcomes that you're going to get. So the better the savings for social care. And there is some hard evidence there from Philip on that. What I'll do, Karen, I've just written your name down. I will just do a quick search around the evidence base, and I'll post that out somehow. Yeah.
Okay. Well, how about I'll do my bit now, and then if you found anything, we
all right. Yes, I will. Yes, yeah.
That gives you a. Yeah, okay. Right.
Oh,
thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Right. I will bring you back in a little while to hopefully answer Karen's question. Right.
Foundations Live.
So now we're going to move on to dealing with high demand in I suppose kind of the DFG part of the process. And there are kind of three elements of that. So I think there's kind of the customer service and how you minimize the time you spend and the cost of managing a waiting list. Thinking about how you can spend your DFG allocation as wisely as possible, and thinking about how you use it to increase the number or maximize the number of adapted and accessible properties in your area. And then what you do need to do, or could do, or should do, if you do actually run out of funds. So starting off with good customer service, I think this kind of probably speaks for itself, that as you'll know from dealing with banks or insurance companies or shops or anybody, having good customer service makes a real difference. It kind of creates confidence. You have to complain less, make fewer calls. and then people are kind of clear on wait times and the information that's required, and you get fewer complaints and at the end of the day, which saves time in the long run. So I think this was quite a useful study or case study from, it's a Latin American airline. They had quite a few challenges and customer inquiries and complaints from flight disruptions and schedule changes. And they implemented a new, more proactive strategy where they had automated notifications, multi-channel stuff through text messages, emails, mobile apps, to ensure that passengers were kept informed of what was happening. And through this kind of proactive strategy, they found that they had a 40% reduction in the amount of people that were phoning them up, much enhanced customer satisfaction, which I think is kind of common sense from any organisations that we've dealt with in work or out of work. So I think one of the key things for a local authority to do is make sure that their DFG page on their website is clear, up to date, and has lots of information for potential or current applicants on how the process works, and saves them having to phone you or getting kind of lost somewhere in the process if they've got a really good explanation of what's involved. So this is a clip from the top of a new web page that we developed earlier in the year, which is basically a template that you can pretty much copy and paste for a DFG page on your own local authority's website. And then the kind of grey box at the right-hand side, which goes down the page against each section, has some hints and tips for how you might customise it for your own local authority. So that's been used quite a lot now by quite a few local authorities, and had some really good feedback on it. And the little video there that you can see on the screen is a short 2 or 3 minute animated explainer video that talks through how the DFG process works and what's involved. And that's also available free of charge. If you want to add that to your website, there's a link on this web page where you can send us an email and we'll send you back the details. So once you've kind of started the process, then I think the next key thing is to really understand your pipeline and where all the cases are in the system. So you can have better financial planning and budgetary control, predict case and completion timelines, reduce bottlenecks, and improve the efficiency of your process. And some of the key aspects of pipeline management to make it work effectively is, I think probably the most important one is, as soon as you receive a referral or an assessment, you assign a cost estimate to the case almost as soon as you receive it, which then means you can forecast your budgets and prevent having any shortfalls, but means you can kind of proactively plot how much you're going to spend month by month throughout the rest of the year, and know how that pipeline and what you're going to achieve in March from the early stages of the year. It can also help you to kind of prioritize cases early, rank cases by urgency and funding availability if you need to. And the other thing that really helps to do is to predict completion timelines for applicants. So you can use historical data to estimate how long it will take from start to finish. And if you're providing realistic timelines to applicants and kind of telling when it's likely to, their work's likely to be completed, then they're much less likely to phone you up and start complaining. It's basically the theory behind it. But one of the things that makes it a little more difficult to predict is the flow of cases through the system. And this is a chart. And we've done quite a lot of deep dives into local systems. And this is kind of fairly typical of the number of cases completed per month by most of the local authorities that we visited. So January is usually fairly slow after the Christmas break. And then it really ramps up in February and March to get all the budget spent before the end of the financial year, which usually means there's not that much left in the pipeline for April, which then is really slow again. starts to pick up a bit through May and June, but then dips down again for some holidays in July and August. Slowly starts picking up again in the autumn, and then slows again for Christmas before you get into January. And this is kind of a fairly typical profile of spend through a year. But if you can move it to something more like this, and this would probably be an extreme and kind of ideal version of it, but if you can smooth out the flow of your cases, so maybe not do quite so many in March and let them flow through April, May and June and through the summer, then it makes it a lot easier to predict when cases will finish. And it also means that for your contractors and the rest of your supply chain, it's a lot more predictable, and it makes it a lot easier for them to fulfill the work you need them to do. So if you can do all that, then you can start to be more transparent about waiting times, provide those realistic timeframes. Having a simple flowchart or FAQ, as I just kind of showed on the sample DFG page, can really help. And if you've got this real data instead of vague promises, then again, it really helps to improve customer service and cuts down the amount of time you have to spend managing your waiting list. Another thing that you could do, if you've got people who are on a waiting list, is to use that time wisely, so that once they get to the front of the queue, that you can then move their application through as quickly as possible. So this is kind of a draft checklist of the sort of things that you could send out to a kind of potential applicant who is on a waiting list, that they could start working through, doing the homework in terms of the things that you'll need when you start working on their case. As we saw with the Copa Airlines example, proactive communication is really good. So things like automated notification through text messages, or having a named contact person that people can speak to really does help. And again, you might think this is teaching granny to suck eggs or very obvious, but thinking back when I used to be in a HIA office, there was always one person in the office when the phone rang. You no. Perhaps they shouldn't be answering the phone. But making sure that you've trained frontline staff to handle difficult conversations with empathy and giving practical advice really does help and really does smooth the process out for everybody involved. So then I want to think about maybe how you might look at spending DFG wisely if you are running short of budget. Maybe think about taking a more strategic view rather than just cutting back on the specification or doing less per case, which could be counterproductive if then that means that the adaptations are ripped out because they haven't been done in a kind of comprehensive way. So kind of thinking about sustainable budgeting, faster approvals, better value for money, and improved service delivery. And I was kind of taking the analogy of Clark shoes, where you may, if you kind of had kids, you probably queued up in a similar to this at the in September or August before they got back to school to get new shoes fitted, rather than buying kind of the cheap supermarket ones that are worn out by half term. So I think that the kind of analogy with DFGs is that cheap white plastic grab rails may do the job short term, but they're much more likely to be ripped out, particularly if a tenant moves into social housing, which wastes money. So an investment in well-designed, durable solutions that stay in place for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that don't just benefit the current occupant or applicant, but are also there for future residents, will start to save you money over a period of time. And when we were at the roadshows, a couple of the sponsors came up and I started talking about how they're now developing much more aesthetically pleasing adaptations. And they were kind of talking about how the picture on the right there, or sort of something similar to the picture on the right, can now be more cost effective and actually cheaper to do than the kind of the picture on the left. So it's not just investing for the long term. It can actually be cheaper in the modern day to think about doing things a little bit differently in terms of your specification. And certainly the suppliers and manufacturers were talking about how the picture on the right can now be a cheaper option than the one on the left. And then the other thing I think it's really important to consider, if you're not already doing so, is the role of landlords and landlord applications. I spoke about this quite a lot, so that if you wanted to go back, there are previous Foundations Lives where I've gone into this in quite a lot of detail, but it's something that's been in the legislation since 1989, but has been very rarely used in practice. And what are the benefits of the landlord making an application? Well, for the tenant, it means they just have the one point of contact, which is their landlord. They don't have to bounce between the landlord, the local authority, and perhaps social services as well. Means testing doesn't apply on the quid pro quo that the local authority can have nomination rights to the property for the next 5 years, which means that you can start to build up a relationship with landlords where properties are kept as adapted and accessible, and that you're working with them to make the best use of the stock and support people to move into those properties. And last year, when we were talking about landlord applications, as I was kind of showing in a minute, that there are some additional benefits in terms of those conversations, but kind of directly makes CDM, asbestos checks, a lot easier. If you're struggling to cope with demand in your agency, then some of the work can be done by the landlord, take some of the work off your head. And it's already allowed for in the legislation. On our website, we've got a landlord grant application form that you could start using later this afternoon if you wanted to. And this was the case study that I was referring to, where a local authority was working very closely with their local LSVT housing association. And what they found was that when the tenant went to the housing association first and had the housing options discussion first, rather than starting to talk about what adaptations they may have, then they were much more likely to move to a better property, more suitable property. Landlord took responsibility of handling the paperwork, project management, and reduced the admin. And you get this flow of more sustainable adaptations because the landlord knows that if a property is going to be adapted, it's much more likely that he can find or move an existing tenant into that adapted property in the future. So it's streamlining applications, support better housing choices, and ensures a sustainable, cost-effective adaptations. So that's what I was kind of saying at the start. I wouldn't recommend doing a cheaper adaptation. I would recommend taking a more strategic view and thinking about how you can use that funding to make sure that the housing stock in your area becomes more increasingly accessible over a period of time. I'll mention landlords again a little bit later this afternoon. So if you do run out of money, what are the options? I think most local authorities would probably stop approving grants and slow down the application process. Seen that quite a lot. But the other option is to carry on approving grants, but defer the date or delay the payment date. This is something that's been growing for the last couple of years, and it's in the Delta return, so we'll find out in a few weeks' time what the figure was for 24-25. But you see, it's something that has definitely been on the increase for the last couple of years and indicates that more local authorities have been running out of funds towards the end of the year. It's covered under Section 36 of the Housing Grants Construction and Regeneration Act. And basically what this is saying is that you approve a grant in the normal way, but you put a condition on it that you won't pay it until a later date. So you've approved the grant, but you'll say we won't pay it until 1st of April, for example. So you continue to approve grants. You can say you won't pay until 1st of April, which is kind of typically how it works. If there's extra money in the financial year, which we did have last year, then you already have the grants approved. So all that work's been done. You can just say to the contractor, actually, now you can just go ahead. In some circumstances, the applicants do choose to pay the contractor early, maybe through kind of family or friends, and then reclaim the grant on 1st of April. And particularly as again towards the end of the financial year, contractors may do the work in advance, knowing that they're going to be paid on the 1st of April. I think one of the other important things, as I mentioned, it is part of the Delta returns, so that if you've recorded that you've deferred a number of grants, then the government can also see that you've run out of money, and it helps to make the case for continuing to increase the DFG allocation in the future. But just to remember that you do still have a statutory duty to approve grants, even if you spend all of your allocation. There was a case back in the 90s, case laws on the Foundation's website, if you want to read it, which basically said that lack of budget wasn't a valid reason for refusing to approve a grant. But you can defer a grant totally legitimately. So just before I do a quick or move on to using discretion differently, what we want to do at the Roadshows would just give a quick update on the Building Safety Act, because it's becoming quite a live issue for a number of local authorities, particularly if you've got a number of high-rise buildings in your area. So the Building Safety Act came into force in 2022 as a response to the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and it's aimed at improving safety and accountability across construction. And it applies to all works where building regulations is required. But there are additional stricter requirements, which is probably where most of you have heard it already, around higher risk buildings, those that are 18 metres or 7 or more stories high. So it is relatively similar to the CDM regulations, construction design and management regulations. One of the key differences, CDM applies to all building work from fitting a grab rail through to building HS2, whereas Building Safety Act applies where building regs apply. And when kind of been out and about in the past talking about CDM, that there's been quite a variety of responses from different councils where we've been. Some have got very detailed risk assessments, documents, processes in terms of health and safety and CDM. Most are somewhere in the middle, but there have been a few that have said that this isn't very high risk work, and we haven't got the time to do or kind of implement the CDM regs, which is kind of quite a risky thing to do, because they are a statutory requirement. And while it's not perhaps the riskiest area of construction, people have still died through adaptations into the home. None of these cases are actually DFG funded, but it's not without risk carrying out adaptations. So in terms of the Building Safety Act, and for those of you that are familiar with CDM, you'll see that the roles are very similar. In fact, intentionally so that it somewhat aligns. So you have the client, who appoints the designer and the contractor, ensures compliance with the Act and shares information. Then you have a designer or principal designer that produces the drawings, coordinates with the designers and flags where there may be higher risk work, and the principal contractor, who delivers the work and coordinates with contractors and supervises the workers. So how does that map onto our typical DFG roles? So it can depend whether it's a grant administration only case where the applicant is sorting everything out themselves and submitting the application, or whether you're providing an agency service. And as usual, we're kind of focusing more on the more typical agency service role. So it's all about who is controlling the adaptations. So if as a local authority, you're in control of how the adaptation's done, which contractor does them, timing of the work, etc., then you would be the client under the Building Safety Act, as you would be under the CDM regs. Also likely to be the designer or principal designer if you're designing the works. But when do the building regs apply, and when does the Building Safety Act apply is kind of the key question. So I've taken this pretty much directly from Local Authority Building Control website, who say that the majority of domestic like-for-like replacement of kitchens or bathrooms won't need any form of building regs approval. But if you're modifying the existing layout, particularly with regard to the drainage, then approval may be needed. So appreciate this is slightly small on the screen. The website does have a fuller copy of these slides, but it gives you a summary. Again, this is from LABC, of the different situations when building regs would apply, and so when the Building Safety Act would also apply. So what must you do if the Building Safety Act does apply? One of the key things is that the client must ensure competency. So the client must ensure that the designer is competent, that they have relevant qualifications, professional memberships, maybe experience in similar projects, insurance, ongoing CPD and training, and that also the contractor is competent or contractors are competent, that they have trade certifications, a proven track record, insurance, up-to-date training, and memberships, and maybe something like the Home Adaptations Installer Network, which I will speak a little bit about in a minute. But the other thing is, as kind of mentioned earlier on, if a building is deemed to be high risk, and these are buildings that are more than 18 metres or 7 stories high, and the adaptation might affect structural or fire integrity, then an application is required to the new building regulator, to the regulator under the Building Safety Act, which is a bit like a building regs application, but has more detail in terms of risk assessments and evidence of the contractor and designer's competence, information about the building's construction, and how you've engaged with the accountable person for the property, which is usually the kind of landlord or the freeholder. And this is a kind of a mandatory thing to do. So if you're putting in a new extract fan through the wall, for example, or putting a new connection into the saw stack, then you'd almost certainly need to apply to the regulator. Officially, it should take 8 to 12 weeks, but there's quite a backlog of these cases. And from some of the people who've already been through it, it can take over 20 weeks. So kind of going back to what we were saying earlier about managing timescales and kind of supporting people through the process, I would likely prioritize these cases because you know there's going to be at least a 20-week late a little bit further down the line. So the Home Adaptations Installer Network came from a bit of research we did 2 or 3 years ago, where we found that over 40% of local authorities didn't have a formal list of contractors to use for DFGs. Here on the left here are a couple of the quotes from the DFG guidance that recognise that contractors are a crucial part of the process, and authorities should have developed a list of qualified contractors. So to make that a possibility, we've worked with an organisation called Diversity to develop the Home Adaptations Installer Network, which brings together householders, registered installers, and local authorities, with the aim to provide consumers the confidence in choosing the right contractors to deliver the adaptation work in their home. So it's a list of contractors that you can work with and have been vetted and checked as a local authority, but it's also a list that any householders in your area, maybe the ones that aren't eligible or don't apply for a DFG, can also use rather than going to the back of one of the daily papers or whatever the modern equivalent of the Yellow Pages is. The network has quality at its core, so it's based and extended on Trustmark, which is the only government-endorsed quality scheme. And it has comprehensive vetting, so that this isn't actually the full list, but it goes to things like financial checks, business insurances, consumer reviews on website, documentation checks, checking their qualifications and memberships, and actually checking if they're still up to date, direct checks, and importantly, DBS checks. That's all done for you rather than you having to do them as a local authority. That's what the website looks like. It's at homeadaptations.co.uk if you want to have a look at it. And it is now live, developed by ourselves on diversity, and it's completely free of charge for local authorities to use. There's a small charge for contractors in terms of being assessed and then maintaining their listing on the list. But for them, it means that they don't have to complete lots of different forms for each local authority, and they can also pick up more work from the public once it goes live to the public later in the year. So it's now available for local authorities. You can transfer your existing list if you have one and have allow diversity to do all the checks for you on your behalf, that you don't have to do that bit of admin. And if you haven't got a list already, they can work with you to recruit local contractors, get them checked, and make sure that you have a list available for your DFG works. If you're interested in works and contractors and kind of health and safety and all those sorts of bits and pieces, one of our masterclasses around works and contractors. We also do have others on how to write and research housing assistance policy, decision making and the role of the OT. We've got a new one on caseworkers and how to deliver a casework service. And later in the year, we'll have one on streamlining the DFG process. Right, let's just double check the comments and questions before we move on. Let's have a look what we got here. So if you have statutory duty to approve grants, if you're out of money under a HRA budget, is it legal to say no money available? You have to wait next year, the 6-month decision time. So the DFG legislation applies across all tenures. And if you want to be legally compliant, you would defer approvals using your HRA funds as you would with any other DFG, rather than saying you'll have to wait till next year, which the Ombudsman could very well take exception to if somebody complained. The legally compliant route is to approve but defer payment as I set out earlier. So I think, Mike, the thing is that additional money has been provided, not every year, but in some years. But it also helps you to smooth out the flow of grants for the process, as I kind of talked about earlier, and is also kind of the compliant way of doing it, rather than stopping making approvals. And Michael, I'm assuming you mean homeadaptations.co.uk. I will pop it in the chat towards the end. In fact, I'll do it now. Unfortunately, Dan's on holiday this week, so I'm flying solo. But there you go. That's the link if you want to look at the website. Right, let's go on to using discretion differently then. So this has been the growth in DFG allocations from the government over the last 15 years or so. And you can see they increased significantly back in 2015 when the Better Care Fund was set up and funding switched from being provided by Ministry of Housing through to the Department of Health and Social Care. And it started to be seen that DFG was a key component of keeping people safely at home as part of the approach to social care. And since 2016-17, it's continually risen and to the point where we're currently at about 715,000. Sorry, 715 million, 715,000. So it's getting on for £1 billion a year. The spending review is next Wednesday lunchtime, which I'm hoping for a birthday present of even more funding, but we'll see what happens. But it's also, we're due to hear about what will happen with the upper limit as part of the spending review as well. So 715,000 at this point. And this is kind of overlaying from the Delta returns the number of completions that have been achieved every year. So you can see back in 2014, 2015, completions are actually starting to fall. Money was increased, and that's where a lot of local authorities started to use their discretion to do things like topping up larger grants or waiving the means test in some situations. So that was quite common, or some of the most common use of housing assistance policies. Grants again dipped down a little during the kind of pandemic years and have started to pick up again since. We can see the rate of increase has started to tail off a little. So rather than thinking about how to make the most of their budget, some local authorities are now starting to think about perhaps how to use their discretion a little bit differently to make the most of the budget. And I think one of the key things to do, if you're a local authority that still waives the means test or does very extensive top-up grants, is just to check how you are against your budget and kind of predicting where you will be later in the year. Because there have been some local authorities that were quite generous, certainly in terms of waiving the means test, and then didn't turn off the tap quickly enough and found that they'd run out of budget and ran up quite a big waiting list. So if that's potentially your situation, it's well worth looking at turning off the tap in advance. I'll turn that off in case you'll want to run to the loo. Right. In terms of using discretion, the main legislation for DFG, or the main rules and regulations for DFG, are set out in the Housing Grants Construction and Regeneration Act from '96. And alongside that, there are various regulations and orders. So for example, the Housing Renewal Grants Regulation sets out how the means test works, and that's been updated through some subsequent orders since. And the upper limit was last changed using the maximum amounts and additional purposes order from 2008. But what we found was that, as I said earlier, most local authorities use their housing assistance policy to either vary the means test or have a top-up grant and increase the upper limit. In terms of the upper limit, we're going to be talking about that and kind of high cost adaptations. Our summit is on the 7th of July in Birmingham. So if you want to have some learn how to manage high cost adaptations, and hopefully then we will also know, or by then we'll also know what's happened to the upper limit. Great to see you in central Birmingham on the 8th of July. In terms of the means test, on our website we did we had some interns with us last year who read through all 250 odd housing assistance policies that have been published across England, and they went through and categorized them all. So in terms of the means test, as well as waiving it in certain circumstances, like if the cost was under 5,000 or 10,000, it's just some other alternatives that some local authorities have offered. So for instance, giving a grant against the contribution, using the social care charging formula, which looks more at savings than it does at income. A couple of local authorities have tweaked the housing allowance within the DFG means test calculation. And as mentioned earlier, landlord applications can be a really good strategic way of creating an alternative to the means test through having nomination rights. But what if we started from scratch? What if we weren't bound by the existing legislation? What would we want to do with the DFG funding in our area? What gives the best return on investment if we're not funding things as a DFG in some way? So what we went through as well, or what the interns went through, as well as looking what the kind of the typical use of housing assistance policies were, they picked out some of the examples of some of the slightly less common but maybe kind of interesting things that others have done, seen as a good investment and a good use of the DFG allocation. So it was looking at currently the means test and the upper limit are focusing discretion on cases where the applicant and the client can't fund the adaptations. We know the upper limit is being reviewed. So what other ways could we target our DFG funds if it's not based on the inability of the applicant or client to pay? So number one was looking at prioritising funding on multi-occupancy households. So if there's more than one disabled person in the household, if you're doing an adaptation that supports multiple people, you could see that as being good value for money. Another example is around health inequalities, that poor housing conditions are linked to high rates of physical and mental health. So alongside adaptations, doing things about damp, inadequate heating or structural disrepair can be a good investment. One local authority found used some of the DFG allocations as pretty much an additional purpose to make adaptations in the home that made it possible for the disabled person to work from home, on the balance that it reduced reliance on benefits and increased tax contributions. A key one, I think, and this is definitely worth looking at, is supporting carers to continue in their role. A large number of people are going to residential care. It's because their main carer is burnt out and no longer able to support them. So home adaptations that reduce manual handling, like hoists and level access showers, can have a real return on investment impact. Preventing hospital admissions and readmissions, so focusing on perhaps doing adaptations for somebody who's at high risk of falling before they fall, again, can have a real return on investment. Thinking about homelessness, local authorities have significant duties and significant costs around homelessness. So if the DFG funding can be used to provide adaptations to support homelessness or people with disability and homelessness, again, that can really be helpful. Working with the landlords in your private rented sector to increase the availability of accessible homes and reduce the pressure on social housing, again, can be really impactful. And again, kind of going back to working with social landlords, quite often they're investing in decent home programs that are replacing bathrooms and potentially kitchens. So if you could work with them to make sure that any bathrooms they replace, or some of the bathrooms that they replace, are suitable for disabled tenants, rather than having to rip it out and adapt it later. Again, that can be really impactful, and as part of working with them on landlord applications, can really start to improve relationships between local authorities and landlords. So as I mentioned, we do have the High Cost Adaptation Summit coming up on the 8th of July. It's the Birmingham Conference and Events Centre. We've got a range of speakers, a range of workshops, and I think it's about thinking about these high cost adaptations differently, that they're not your standard DFG. They are very much more complicated, very different from doing a level access shower or a ramp or a stair lift. And we'll be looking at some of the options around how you can do that differently on the 8th of July. So a few tickets left, but if you're interested in that, there's a QR code, or you can find the details on the Foundation's website. I just want to finish off with a kind of a plea that we like to share good news stories about DFGs, because quite often when they hit the press or hit social media, it's the ones that have gone wrong or been delayed that often get the publicity, whereas we know there are 50 or 60,000 cases every year where lives are really changed for the better through DFGs. But we need your stories to be able to share them. So in the How We Help section on the website, there's a short form where you can just give us a few details, and we'll use that to kind of create an anonymous little case story, little story that we'll share out on social media to try and change the narrative a little bit about what DFG does and what you will do to support people. So we don't have any of those stories ourselves, so we do rely on you to share those with us. So hopefully you've got one or two that you could share, and that'd be really appreciated. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'll just bring Rachel back to see if she's got some research.
Right, I did very busily try to look at bits and pieces, and I can't. There is some bits and pieces around trusted assessor, but tends to relate with kind of more that discharge to assess and health working with care homes. We do have some FOI information that we gathered a couple of years ago. I think we had about just over 100 local authorities that responded to their FOI. And what we can say with that is those local authorities with higher numbers of OT assistants or trusted assessors did carry out more assessments. And again, those local authorities that had higher numbers of OTAs and trusted assessors did their assessments led to more lower level adaptations. And another interesting finding from that FOI was that those local authorities that are very reliant on panels, so where lots of cases where you might put everything through a panel, or you have a panel to review recommendations for DFGs, those local authorities tended to have higher waiting lists. I appreciate that's not linked to trusted assessors, but but in terms of the hard evidence base, I think there's probably conversation going forward, Paul, about possibly doing something around that.
I mean, it's a relatively new model of doing assessment, isn't it? So, I mean, adaptation of their delay came out, what, 20?
So it's 6 years ago, yeah. And I guess although 6 years ago sounds like a long time ago in terms of the model being really embedded, particularly within housing teams getting trusted assessor, it's probably less so,
And I think the kind of Bath 2 study, while it didn't directly talk or look at the role of trusted assessors, it's probably kind of thinking about it. I suppose the big picture is that the quicker you do an adaptation, the more impact it has, and that the bigger the cost savings are across the public sector.
The system,
So if you've got delays, Karen, in terms of the way you carry out assessments and adaptations at the moment, and trusted assessors is a way that you feel that you can speed up that process, then that might be one of a number of initiatives that you introduce to speed up that process and kind of generate the savings that the Bath 2 project showed can be there. I think there'll be more on the Bath 2 project soon, won't there, Rachel? Because there's kind of a calculator and the kind of formal papers will be out fairly shortly. So if we're kind of talking about Bath 2, and that means absolutely nothing to you, if you go back a couple of webinars, we did have a quite in-depth look at the results that are going to be coming out of that, and you can find a slightly shorter version on YouTube. So if you're interested on that in the interim, that there's kind of a really good explanation of it. I'm sure when the final report is fully published and we've got the online calculator, it's something that we'll return to at a future Foundations Live. So cool. Karen's going to look at the Bath 2 project, so that's a That's a good one. That's a good one. But if you need any help or support, Karen, then as always, get in touch at info@foundations.uk.com, and we'll do our best to help. Okay. Was there anything finally you wanted to add, Rachel? Has anything occurred to you while you've been researching? Nope.
No.
Okay.
No, I've managed to find the link to
Great.
the back out to if I did.
Perfect.
When you wanted
Thank
to
you.
post that, I'm
Thank
just
you.
posting it now for.
Great. Thank you. Right.
Foundations Live.
Right. So thank you to just Rachel today, wasn't it, for joining me. We've got some more Foundations Lives coming up, if I can find the right thing to show you. So coming up in kind of over the next few weeks and months. Next month, on the 1st of July, we're publishing a new report on providing home automations or kind of assistive technology. So there's kind of two aspects of that. The report looked at whether handy persons could be trained to install assistive technology, kind of low-level stuff like Alexas, Google Homes, Ring doorbells, how receptive people were to having that in the home, how useful it was, and how much the handy people were kind of called back if it went wrong, or whether it was fairly plug and play. So that report will be out on 1st of July, and we'll also have a new guide on home automations that you may fund through a DFG, and some presentations around how that might work. On the 5th of August, we're going to have a Foundations Live around behaviours of concern and some new design guidance that we've been developing on how to design and spec adaptations for households with somebody with a behaviour of concern. At the start of September, we're going to be joined by some of our exhibitors and manufacturers and suppliers who will be sharing some of their CPD opportunities that they all kind of talk about on Foundations Live, and also the things that they can come and talk to you about over a few sandwiches and a cup of coffee over a lunchtime. And then finally, later in September, we'll have a special Foundations Live all about the home adaptations installer network and some of the councils who have already started to use it and how they found it. So if you'd like to join and be part of that, then please do get in touch in advance. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. As usual, you will get an email afterwards asking you for your feedback and offering you a CPD certificate if you want one. If you want it in advance, you can go to foundations.uk.com/webinar feedback. So thank you all for joining us. Hope you found that useful. There will be more the dates for those fairly shortly, and as usual, they go to the Facebook group first, but we'll be visiting, off the top of my head, Southampton, Liverpool, Wolverhampton, Sheffield and London. So if you live in one of those areas, we'll look forward to seeing you in the autumn with more good stuff about DFGs. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. If you want to watch it on demand, it'll be on the website for the rest of the week, or if you want to refer any of your colleagues onto it, so it's on the website for the rest of the week, and after that, it'll be on YouTube. So thank you all for today, and we'll see you again very soon.